Let's see. One hot topic in the financial world right now is the PPP loan, the Paycheck Protection Program. We've talked about that a couple of times on the podcast. I wanted to take a look at one of the interesting things that's happened. Is there's an article in CNBC entitled "Ruth's Chris Steakhouse owner says it will repay 20 million in small business loans." And so, what's going on is that the loan was originally set up so that companies who had less than 500 employees could apply, and Ruth's Chris kind of sidestepped that rule by applying using two subsidiaries that each individually had under 500 employees. And so they then were approved, got the 20 million in loans, and then had subsequently decided that it was a bad PR move and that it wasn't the intent. When they saw that the loan ran out of money for other businesses, they realized what impact they were having, and so they're going to go ahead and pay back that money, which is a good intention. And we saw Shake Shack actually do the same thing. But I thought it was interesting because the way the law was written is that when payments happen, it doesn't necessarily generate new loans. So even though they said, okay, oops, we're going to go ahead and give all the money back, it's not a given that that money will then result in new loans made to the businesses who would have gotten it had they not taken the money. And so I guess what I wanted to talk about is kind of whose fault is it when regulation doesn't work? When they set up these kinds of deals and then companies abide by the rules, but the outcome isn't what people kind of generally agree should have happened, then, is it the fault of the regulators or is it the fault of the business who maybe knew they were doing something questionable? And so, yeah, I just want to kind of open that up for discussion.
Yeah, and actually, Brian Crow, friend of the podcast, sent over some numbers. The latest Seeking Alpha article, or I guess bullet points, kind of said that at least 243 million went out of the 349, which doesn't seem like a staggering amount compared to the 349 billion that was pledged. But publicly traded companies, 15 with over 15 of them with over market caps of 100 million. So I thought that was kind of different when it was small business, and I guess the SBA probably should have done a better job of defining what a small business was and who would apply for those or who could apply for those. I think we talked on a prior podcast how venture-backed firms were being considered and how that was kind of loosely put in and not well defined until later. So yeah, I think the onus lies with who the loans are originating with and who's drafting that kind of requirements for the loans. I think the blame solely lies with them. These companies were acting in their, selfish best interest to try and keep afloat during the time. It's not just because they're publicly traded or really large companies that they don't need some kind of payroll protection or some kind of business protection. But I think the way the loan was marketed through the Small Business Administration and being, basically led the public persona that it was for smaller companies. I think that's why you're seeing a lot of this backlash, and probably that lies with who made up those regulations in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It is the legislatures and the rule makers who kind of mess this up. And I mean, it's very similar to what we see with a lot of tax rules, right? So if you're asking the large picture conceptual question, is it ethical or is it good for businesses to optimize their use of the rules to take the best advantage of government programs and to minimize their tax liabilities when we're talking taxes? As an ex tax advisor, I do broader stuff now, but as somebody who did a lot of corporate tax advising, I wholeheartedly believe that it's perfectly reasonable and fine for companies to maximize their use of the rules and the regulations, because the problem in our system with the republic that we live in is that when you try to say that the intent of a rule was a singular thing, you can't do that, because any kind of rule like this was created by a Congress made up of a lot of different people with a lot of different intents. And then it was signed off by a president who may have had a slightly different intent. And so the reality then is that you have to then kind of look at, well, what is the result? What are the rules of the game here? And it sounds cynical to call it a game, but to some extent it is, right? And what are the rules that we're playing by? And are we fairly and in good faith trying to follow those rules? And I think that would be true in the case of PPP, just like it is true in the case of following and adhering to corporate tax laws. And in this particular case, I mean, you can see kind of the chain of events that went wrong here in terms of, you can see how the politics kind of was a backlash to how they actually just wrote the rules wrong for what now they're saying they intended, right? It's the politics that's circling back and saying, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's not what we intended. But they started out, the PPP started out with the idea of, hey, we need to get money out to small businesses so that they can maintain jobs. And that was the first kind of thrust of the idea. And then from there, what they realized, which actually is, you know, you can disagree with this, but it's also somewhat logical, is that, hey, one of the industries that's hardest hit by this whole thing is restaurants and hospitality. And so when we define a small business as being 500 or less, maybe we need to make an exception for restaurants and hospitality if they've got lots of different restaurant locations and we want to keep those people employed, right? So just because a one company might have a lot of different locations, maybe we want to let them have access to this money as well. That was decided in the law. It wasn't like somebody just came up with this idea after the fact. They decided to do that in the law. They made that part of the law, that it was not only for just what you might strictly think of as a small business with less than 500 employees. They actually threw this exception in there and said, hey, if your company actually has more than 500 employees, we'll still let you get this if you have less employees on a by location basis. What's interesting about the article that we looked at is it's hard to tell exactly what the technical issue there was for Ruth Chris, or if there even was a technical issue, because you would imagine that Ruth Chris could avail themselves of the by location rules, right? But then the article talks about the legal subsidiaries, which seem like that would be that wouldn't really be an issue one way or the other, because if you get into the depths of the rules here, there were what they called affiliate rules, which said that, you know, if you get outside, forget the special rules for restaurant hospitality. If you have two companies that are affiliates of each other, each may have less than 500 employees on their own, but combined they would have more than 500 employees. You just flat out didn't qualify. And that was clear in the rules because they would be affiliated with each other. So I don't know if that's the issue with Ruth Chris, if they're saying, hey, they did something they weren't really qualified for and they got away with it and now they're putting it back, or if they really did qualify themselves based on the by location rule.
Yeah, I think my belief or my understanding of the article was that they truly did qualify, but they just didn't intend for it to run out of money so quick, and they didn't intend for probably such a negative PR move to have come out of their decision to take the loan. And so
here's the iffy part on the did you qualify, right? Because the rules were confusing. You know, when we talk about putting the onus on the rule makers, they were confusing in terms of the eligibility requirements. And basically what they said is, hey, it's not up to the bank to determine whether you're eligible or not. It's up to the borrower to determine whether they're eligible and to certify that they're eligible, right? So it's interesting on this topic that this article is talking about. People may have seen that there were press conferences with Trump and Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, citing these very cases. And Mnuchin said something very interesting. The words that came out of Mnuchin's mouth, he said, we're not sure that people understood what they were certifying, or whether they actually knew the rules well enough to properly certify that they were eligible. So, you know, that statement led me to believe that the Treasury, Mnuchin and the Treasury, were thinking that perhaps they were going to claim that some of these companies actually violated the rules, but just didn't understand that they violated the rules. Now, I don't know exactly what the technicality of that would be, but it was an interesting statement that he made in that press conference when he said that. And so, and I think there's two pieces to it. Like, there's are you a small business, right? That was one thing that primarily seems like was a lot of the anger that you heard over this was companies that weren't small businesses. But there's a secondary kind of concern, and Trump kind of spoke to it. And it was in the same conference or press conference where Mnuchin made that statement. Trump railed against Harvard because they took the PPP. And basically Trump's line of thinking on this was not about how big Harvard was. That's not the statements he was making. What he was saying is they clearly had a lot of money because of their endowments. So they just didn't need it. That was his rationale. So the thing about this is that what they asked businesses to certify to, this is the confusing part, right? Because they didn't ask businesses to certify that their business had already been damaged due to coronavirus, and therefore or that they were going to imminently run out of money. There wasn't a requirement that you certify that. The requirement was that you certify that there was uncertainties in your business due to the coronavirus. Well, almost everybody can certify that. Even if you have lots of money in the bank, you might have uncertainties as to what's going to happen with your business due to the coronavirus. None of us know where this is going yet, or what it's going to ultimately do to the economy or anything like that. But it's interesting because it was in that context that Mnuchin said, we're not sure people understood what they were certifying. So I don't know how much of it is about the politics of how big the organization is, or about the politics of whether you really need it or not. Because what we actually know is that even if you were a small business, there's some small businesses that are well capitalized that may not have technically needed it, but took the PPP as well. And so I think there's a lot of people biting their fingernails right now wondering, oh, well, if there's going to be political backlash like this about size, is there going to be some kind of auditing or political backlash on the fact that some of us took this, even though we had a bunch of cash in the bank already anyway?
And since we have Ty riled up already, I might mention that they specifically carved out that you didn't need anything certified by an accountant. Also, so
yes,
can't blame us accountants for this one. You know, we'll take full blame for all the tax issues, but like this one, we can't. You know, they didn't ask us to certify it. So.
Well, you know, we're editorial here, so we don't have to deal with facts. And so I'll say I've heard a rumor. I've heard
people say, right?
Yeah, I've heard people say that there may be something going on with the SBA, maybe engaging third parties or potentially auditors to start looking at companies that took the money and seeing whether they should have qualified or not, kind of thing.
Well, while we're doing rumors, I thought I'd also just bring up the other rumor that I've heard on this topic, which is that I've heard a lot of backlash saying that banks intentionally shuffled the deck, so to speak, so that big companies would get the loans quicker than smaller companies because they were their bigger clients and that sort of a thing. And so I just think that's another interesting variable in it, is whether or not you believe that happened, because clearly that was the intent of the law at any point. And I don't know if that's the case, but it's just kind of an interesting factor to consider when you have a fixed amount of money to distribute, you know.
Well, it wasn't, you know, and that wasn't necessarily part of the law, but I don't think it was necessarily ruled out in the law either. And I think there is a rationale from a banking perspective on this point, because, and I heard as people were applying, I heard a few different banks and banking associations make this case that there's some rules that came in with banks and it had to do with dealing with money laundering and terrorism and stuff like that. But there were rules that had come in over the last decade which require that banks get a lot of information from their clients, essentially, in order to go through a financial transaction. And so what the banks were basically saying up front, they were saying this weeks ago, before the PPP ran out and before even applications were open. They were openly saying this point that, hey, we're probably going to serve our customers with existing relationships first, because they're going to be first in line, because we've already checked that box. We've already gotten over that particular regulatory requirement of knowing our client with them, so we can get to them faster than somebody that we haven't worked with. And so that was just a reality on the ground, that if you had a banking relationship with a bank that works with the SBA, you were already you were just going to be ahead of the game. That's just how it was.
I think there's kind of like two subpoints there, though. I think that makes perfect sense. Like if you're going to do a loan, and if you've already created an online profile and done all your customer work, then it's going to be easier for that bank to loan you money. And I think that is legitimate. Like that's just the facts of trying to do this. But I think that the secondary question of, are larger institutions favored, is maybe that's a different question that is similar. But I think maybe a lot of people would say, yeah, it's fine to favor people who have an online banking, but not because of the fact that they are gigantic as a customer or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the business aspect, though. If you thinking about that point that you just made in the context of some of the big deals that we were looking at in the article, it's like, well, if you can make one $20 million loan versus lots of little loans, and you're going to get essentially the same commission as a bank, what are you going to do?
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Specified. So it should have been written, if they didn't want that to, it's then obvious that they're going to give the money to the big companies. But then if they didn't want that, should have been written in some way,
Yeah. The incentive structures had to be set up in a way to inspire that. Yeah.
Maybe I get you guys' take on this, because I think, setting the funding side apart, I've heard from clients that have got the PPP delivered. Now they're trying to track the eligible cost and trying to have, I guess, strategies around that, and then input from the bank. And so they've been asking the bank if they're, tell us what the eligible, do you have a listing of how you would like to see the eligible expenses, what the SBA is requiring for those expenses to be, forgiven, for the loan to be forgiven. And the bank's answer, at least the bank that I saw answer the client, said, they haven't issued those yet, and, they're not available. So I think the big challenge is, here these people have this money and what it's directed towards, and they have a pretty good idea of what's allowed to be expended, or what would be forgivable portion of it, but tracking and then what form they want to see and what the requirements are that they're going to need to present when they go for forgiveness is unknown at this point.
There's definitely some unknowns in the technicalities of that, but not surprising, what most banks are saying, drum roll please, is open a separate bank account, of course, and put all your PPP money in there, and then you can use that to better manage your expenses. As far as I know, there's no actual requirement for that in the law itself, but that's the guidance that most banks have been giving out.
So we got given that story by banks as well in the companies that I've worked with, and we're adhering to it because we feel like it's worthwhile to do, and it's easy to do when you're working with the money that has been loaned to you. It's an easy concession to make. But yeah, I do think it's interesting, because I did see an article talking about how it was fine if you had routed the expenses through a credit card and then used the funds from the loan to pay the credit card, that could be fine. So I do think there's a lot of what you're saying, banks just trying to get you to use their stuff.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, that was the answer. That was the answer I got from, or the client got from the bank. Well, we don't have that. The easiest way to track it would be to open up a new bank account. So it's funny.